Are you the king of the Jews? Look at how they accuse you. Are you not going to respond? Remember, I have the power to release you or crucify you.
Pilate declared that Jesus was not guilty, but what happened next doesn't make sense. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't confusion, and it wasn't a lack of information. It was a conscious decision made by a man who fully understood exactly what he was doing. And that's what makes it uncomfortable, because when the truth is clear from the very beginning, the problem is no longer the trial, it's the one who chooses to ignore it. Because there is something in this story that doesn't quite fit. That day in Jerusalem, what was at stake was not just the life of one man, but something far more fragile: control. Jerusalem looked stable, but it wasn't. It was a territory where religion, identity, and power were deeply intertwined, creating a constant tension that could break at any moment. Rome knew this, and that's why they didn't send governors to be fair, but to prevent chaos. Pilate was there for that exact reason, and his record made it clear that maintaining that balance was not easy. He had already provoked tensions before, he had made political mistakes, and he knew that Rome was watching every single move he made. In the empire, losing control was not an option. It was a sentence, and Pilate had already come close to losing that control once before. And that changed everything. So when Jesus was brought before him, Pilate didn't just see an accused man, he saw the center of an unstable situation. The accusations didn't match the evidence, but they came with something far more unsettling: urgency. And when urgency overtakes evidence, it is almost never about justice. It becomes about pressure, about interests, about something that hasn't been said yet, but can already be felt in the air. And that was the risk. While Pilate was trying to understand what was happening, outside, the city was beginning to change. Not in a chaotic way at first, but with a tension that was slowly building, as if something was accumulating beneath the surface. Voices began to rise, groups started to form, and expectation turned into demand. It was no longer about waiting for a result, but about pushing toward an immediate decision. In that moment, the trial stopped being a legal process and became a countdown. Because there comes a point where the truth stops protecting you and starts putting you at risk. And Pilate was standing right at that point, understanding something that would change everything. That sometimes you are not choosing between what is right and what is wrong. And that was about to force him to decide faster than he expected. Pilate couldn't decide freely, and that was the real problem. He wasn't an independent judge, nor a leader with absolute freedom to act, but an official tasked with maintaining order in one of the most unstable regions of the empire. In that system, the truth was not always enough. What mattered was avoiding consequences. Because when control is lost, everything else stops mattering. And Pilate knew it. Judea had been accumulating deep tensions for years. The differences between Roman authority and the local population were not superficial. They were structural, shaped by cultural, religious, and political conflict. Pilate had already experienced it firsthand. He knew that a poorly calculated decision could trigger a chain reaction, and that a crowd, once activated, cannot be stopped with arguments. It is stopped with outcomes. And that completely changed the nature of the problem in front of him. But the real problem hadn't even begun yet, and that changed everything. Jesus did not represent a direct threat from a military or political standpoint, but what he provoked was far more dangerous. Crowds, expectation, pressure building beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. And when that happens, there is no way to stop it. That kind of risk is not measured by what has already happened, but by what could happen if action is not taken quickly. Pilate understood this when he tried to avoid making a direct decision, searching for a way out that could reduce the tension. But what seemed like a solution wasn't, because every attempt to calm the situation only increased the pressure. the crowd did not disperse. It organized. It did not hesitate. It demanded. And that is where everything changes. Because when a decision stops depending on evidence and starts depending on collective reaction, the truth loses its weight. What matters is no longer what is right, but what prevents immediate conflict, even if that means yielding to pressure. That was the risk. And Pilate began to see it clearly. He was no longer deciding about a man. He was deciding about stability, about his position, about order. And in that kind of decision, the question is not what is just, but what you are willing to sacrifice to maintain control. Because when power is confronted with chaos, there's always a price. And the most dangerous part is that, at that moment, Pilate still didn't understand what his price would be. But he was about to find out. At that point, everything began to slip out of control. Pilate examined the case again, questioned once more, and searched for a justification that would allow him to act without compromising his position, but he couldn't find one. The lack of evidence was still undeniable, and that placed him in a dangerous contradiction. He could not justify a condemnation, but he also could not ignore the pressure growing outside his control, becoming more organized and closer. And that pressure could no longer be contained. The crowd was no longer observing. It was pushing, and it wasn't going to stop. It had become an active force, driving toward a specific outcome. The shouting was not noise. It was organized pressure. And when pressure reaches a certain level, it stops being an external factor and becomes the very center of the decision. Pilate knew it. He knew that if things escalated, it could turn into a revolt. And a revolt in Jerusalem was not a minor issue. It was a direct message to Rome, and Rome did not tolerate messages of weakness, and Pilate could not afford to send one. He tried to find a middle ground, a way to resolve the situation without triggering a greater reaction. But with every passing second, his room to maneuver was disappearing. The pressure increased, the crowd insisted, and the options were reduced to two: yield or face the consequences. At that point, the decision stopped being about justice, and in that moment, everything changed. It was no longer about what was right, but about what was immediate. This is where the real break occurs. Pilate knew that Jesus did not represent a real threat, but he also knew that releasing him could trigger something he would not be able to stop. And when a decision is forced between truth and consequences, consequences almost always win. Not because they are right, but because they are urgent. Because in the politics of the empire, the appearance of order is worth more than an uncomfortable truth. And that changed everything. And then, time ran out. Because there comes a moment when not deciding is also a decision, and that moment had arrived. Pilate understood that any action would carry a cost, but some consequences were far more immediate than others, and it was there, under pressure, with no margin left and everything at stake, that the decision stopped being about justice and became about control. Pilate knew the truth and still chose to ignore it. That is what makes this story uncomfortable, because it was not a mistake or a lack of clarity. It was a conscious decision. In that moment, Pilate did not act as a judge, but as a governor, and that changed everything. Because when the goal is to maintain control, the truth stops being the center and becomes a risk, something to be managed, silenced, or even sacrificed if necessary. And that changed everything. Jesus was no longer a man within a trial, but a variable within a much larger problem. Pilate was not resolving a case, he was preventing a crisis. And under that logic, he chose what he believed to be the lowest immediate risk, even if it meant acting against what he himself had already declared as just. It wasn't ignorance, it was calculation, and that is what makes it even more unsettling. That is the problem. But that does not remove responsibility, it defines it. Because when someone in power chooses between truth and convenience, they are not being dragged by circumstances. They are making a decision. In the end, the decision was not made by the crowd, nor by the circumstances. It was made by him. It was his judgment, his response to pressure, and his need to maintain order that determined the outcome. And there is no way to ignore that, because that day, it wasn't the evidence that failed, and it wasn't the process that failed. It was the one who had the power to decide. And that is the part that transcends the historical moment, because these decisions are not unique. They repeat themselves every time power faces a situation where it must choose between what is right and what is convenient. And almost always, when the pressure is strong enough, convenience wins. Pilate did not choose between guilty and innocent. He chose between stability and truth, and in that process, he sacrificed one to protect the other. But what is most unsettling is not what he did, it is how he justified it. Because by washing his hands, he tried to transfer responsibility to others, as if the truth could be delegated. But responsibility cannot be washed away. It belongs to the one who has the power to act. Because in the end, history is not always changed by facts. It is changed by the decisions made in front of them. And that day, one decision maintained order, but left behind a question that still unsettles us today. What do you do when you know the truth but saying it could destroy everything? That question did not remain in Jerusalem. It remained in history. And every time someone in authority faces an uncomfortable decision, it is still there. Because Pilate was not the first, and he was not the last.